When we study world missions history, the question comes up, what about martyrdom? Who is a martyr? What constitutes a true martyr? And that's not an easy question to answer because people who give their lives in the service of the Lord often die for a variety or even a combination of reasons. And this missionary that we're going to be looking at next here is someone who is often classified as a martyr. And I want to talk to you about that a little bit today. The name of the individual and his wife are John and Betty Stam, and perhaps you have heard of them. They gave their lives while serving in China. And the question has been asked, can we call them genuine Christian martyrs or not? Um, the word martyr, as you may know, comes from the Greek word for witness. In other words, the idea is that a Christian martyr is someone that gives his life because he has been a witness for Christ, and that witness is rejected to the point of death. And the history of Christian missions and the church in general is full of examples of people who gave their lives out of faithful service for the Lord. But there are times when it's questionable as to whether the genuine purpose for killing someone was their Christian witness or if other factors brought about their execution. And that is the case with John and Betty Stam. Now, it's a great story, and I encourage you to dive into it. John was born in 1907, and he was martyred at the age of 27, so he lived till 1934. And Betty, who died at the same time, was just slightly older than he was. They studied at Moody Bible Institute. Now, let's make some connections here. Remember, we studied A.B. Simpson, who was one of the founders of the Bible Institute movement. And so when you think of Moody Bible Institute, your mind should recall the ministry of A.B. Simpson. And that's where they went to school. And they were interested in each other, but neither one of them wanted to be dissuaded from the call of God to the ministry in China, where he believed he had called them. And so they were very cautious in their dating relationship. And here the question arises, when I'm considering God's plans for my future, do I prioritize, the kind of work he's calling me to do, whether it's ministry or something else? Or do I prioritize the possibility of a marriage relationship? And should I meet someone and fall in love with that person, for example, assuming that person is a devout Christian, and that person does not have the same ministry interests or the same passions that I have for future work, should I marry that person? Well, that's not an easy question to answer. My wife told me about her grandmother who went to school in the state of Iowa and really believed that God was calling her to be a missionary, perhaps to China. She wasn't sure, but missionary work. Well, she ended up falling in love with an Iowa farmer who really didn't sense God's direction. He wanted to study to be better equipped to serve faithfully in his local church, but just intended to be a farmer and serve God that way. And so Becky's grandmother had to make a decision. Do I marry a man that I feel like God is leading into my life? Or do I stick with the conviction that God is leading me to be a missionary and reject his offer of marriage? And so her grandmother sought counsel from some of the leaders in the school where she was studying. And one of them said to her the following. He said, if you really believe that God is leading you and this gentleman together, then you need to entrust the leadership of your life and your marriage and God's direction through your husband and allow God to take care of that. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that counsel is up to you. It's something to think about, but she did take his advice. She married the man. They stayed on the farm for the rest of their lives, but they had 6 children, 4 of whom ended up being missionaries in Brazil, one of whom served in a Bible college in the Midwest, and the other one, who was actually the youngest of all the children, was the one that actually ended up staying on the farm and keeping the farm going. So even though Becky's grandmother didn't have the privilege of going to the field personally, God allowed her to see all 6 of her children faithfully serving God. 4 in Brazil, 1 in a Bible college, and 1 faithfully serving on the farm. By the way, the one that stayed on the farm struggled with that, feeling like maybe he was a bit inferior to his siblings. But many, many people along the way reminded him that his faithfulness in keeping the farm and being hospitable to those who came through and faithful in his church were all indications that God was equally blessing his life as he was blessing the lives of his siblings, which I think was a very good thing to say. So now you can hear stories that are kind of the opposite. We had a student here who was an MK from South America, and when she came to Bible college as a freshman, she made it very clear from day one, I'm going to go back and be a missionary in Brazil, and I won't even consider a guy that's not fully convinced that God wants him in Brazil. And she didn't meet anybody who was convinced that God was leading him to Brazil, or anybody that she was interested in. And so she ended up graduating and going back to Brazil as a single missionary. She met a Brazilian man there and married him, and today she and her Brazilian husband and their children are serving the Lord faithfully in Brazil. So the point is, it happens differently for everybody, and it just depends on how God is leading. So God did lead John and Betty together, and they were married in China and began their work there. Now, you have to understand that the political climate in China was a bit hostile toward Americans. And that's, at this point in history, chiefly because of the Boxer Rebellion that took place. You may recall we mentioned the Boxer Rebellion that took place in 1900. And it was a case kind of like King Philip's War, where the Chinese just got really tired of Western incursion and colonialism and all that. And they finally rebelled against that, and it really started a war in which many, many were killed. And it was a very bloody turn of events and a very sad part of history. But that anti-American sentiment continued on for many years after that. And so Americans were not looked upon kindly in China during the first half of the century. So when they went there, they were aware of that, but somebody had informed them that the situation, at least in the region where they were planning to serve, had changed, and the strong feelings of anti-Americanism had subsided, and that they should feel free and safe in entering that region to serve. And so, on the basis of that information, that's exactly what they did. The problem is when they got there, they discovered that those who had given them that information were simply wrong about it. It wasn't done maliciously. It was simply a judgment that had been wrongly calculated. And so as a result, they were only there a couple of weeks before they were captured, and they were actually martyred for the glory of God. They had to do a death march, and they had a baby girl whose name was Priscilla, and you can see her picture there. And, John and Betty at one point just assumed that all 3 of them were going to die. The little girl ended up surviving because the Chinese military captain asked if there's anybody that'd be willing to give his life in exchange for this little girl so that she could live. And a Chinese convict who was already sentenced to die said he would be glad to do that. And so he gave his life, and they spared little Priscilla. And you can see her there with some of her relatives after she was rescued from China and eventually taken back to the United States. And then John also requested that Betty's life be spared and that he die in her place, but they would have none of that. And she ended up dying at the same time he did. And of course, this made the news, and John and Betty Stam were hailed as martyrs. Now, getting back to the issue of martyrs, there are some who would say, yes, indeed, they were martyrs because they died in China as missionaries serving the Lord Jesus Christ and telling people about Jesus. And that is certainly a legitimate conclusion. There are others, however, would say, well, the real motive of the Chinese was not the Christian faith. It was really more the fact that they were Americans. But one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that American and Christian, for many people in the world, are one and the same. We understand, those of us who are Americans, that being an American in no way implies that you're a Christian. But when the two-thirds world looks at America, and even most of Europe for that matter, at least Western Europe, they kind of associate American or Western with Christian. You'll hear people say that Christianity is a Western or American religion. And so it really becomes complex. And I would say personally that we are not out of order in calling John and Betty Stam martyrs for the Christian faith. Yes, they died because they were Americans, but as Americans, they were considered to be Christian. And so the Christianity of Americans was hated just as much as the Americans themselves were hated. And that brought the death of John and Betty Stam. Now, one other thing I want to just call your attention to here. You say, how is it that God would allow a mistake that somebody made about a certain situation to result in the death of John and Betty? I mean, here they've given their lives to serve the Lord, and they're trusting God to use them, and yet somebody makes a wrong statement, a miscalculation, even though it was honest. They were simply wrong about the issue of security in that region, and because of that misinformation, John and Betty Stam die. And all I can say to you is this: even though it was misinformation, when God is ready to take his servants home, it doesn't matter if it's because of misinformation or because of illness or an accident or a storm or a war or whatever the case may be. One thing we can be absolutely sure of is that John and Betty Stam's days were in God's hands. And when God was finished with them on this earth, he would take them home, whether it was by death due to misinformation or for some other reason. And so there are no mistakes in God's plan. And when it appears that something tragic has happened in the life of a believer because of a miscalculation of some sort, we can be absolutely sure that God allowed it because God's plan was for that to take place. That doesn't mean that God is responsible for the murder of John and Betty Stam, but it does mean that God chose not to protect them from this because his course for their work had finished. When Paul said, I have fought the good fight, I've finished the course, I've kept the faith, he said that in around the year 67 or 8, just at the end of his life. But 10 years prior to that, when he was heading for Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey, he was warned by many not to go to Jerusalem because there would be trouble there for him. And he said, I don't count my life dear to me, Acts chapter 20. He said, I just want to complete the course that God has set for me and finish well. And he actually believed that this could have been the end of his life. But in God's plan, he actually lived another decade before actually giving his life and reaching the end of his course. So you and I don't know what the end might be. But the important thing is not that we figure that out, because only God really knows. The important thing is that we yield our lives unconditionally to God for him to use us however he chooses to make our lives testimonies during the period of time that he has sovereignly and perfectly chosen to use us as vessels. And I'm grateful for that absolute assurance. I'm grateful for the testimony of this faithful couple.